as a family physician in Orland Park with an emphasis on nutrition. Mark's interest in Abe Lincoln started 8 years ago when he grew a beard and gave the Gettysburg Address to his children's, it says school, but it's homeschool, and my kids were in there too. Since then, he has shared on stage with Oliver North, Ben Carson, and who was the other guy? Michael Medved, right? Yeah.
A few others.
And a few others, yeah. He's considered, he considers it an honor to have an opportunity to present the wisdom of Lincoln here today. So thank you so much for coming and enjoy the presentation. Oh yeah, and if anyone didn't get one of these, we can hand out one to each family, so. No, we've got a couple, so.
Well, welcome. My purpose today is to give 5 different speeches that were given over a timeline of the presidency. And that sounds like a lot, but some of them are very short. You have here a timeline, which obviously is not a complete timeline of the life of Abraham Lincoln, but the highlighted areas are the speeches that will be presented. On the 3rd page, you have a copy of the Gettysburg Address with some highlights on that, which we can talk about. And the last page is part of the 2nd Inaugural Address, which also has some highlighted areas. I've never given this exact presentation before, so I'm very interested to see what I'm going to say. I'm not completely sure. I know the speeches. It's the filler material that will be interesting. I have been fascinated with the Civil War and the time of the Civil War, as Margaret said, for at least 10 or 12 years, been studying and reading on Abraham Lincoln. And it's been interesting to me that as the times march on, I find more and more motivation to try to understand those times, because our times more and more resemble the times of the Civil War, when there was a great division in the country and a great unrest. I came across a book not too long ago, which I really found interesting to me anyway. I don't know if other people would be interested, but it's by Mark Knoll. He's a local fellow up in Wheaton College. He's written many good history books from a Christian perspective. That book is called The Civil War is a Theological Crisis. Why was the Civil War a theological crisis? Well, for a very simple reason, because as you'll hear in Lincoln's speech, both sides thought God was on their side. Both sides were reading the Bible. One read the Bible and said, this Bible is totally supporting slavery. And one read the Bible and said, slavery is an abomination. And that contention was so great. These sides were so convinced of their position. We ended with a war that cost 623,000, that's the estimate, American lives. It was a particularly costly war because on either side, it was Americans, U.S. citizens that were sacrificing their lives. So if you add up the following 5 wars, including World War II, Korea, World War I, the total is still underneath the total for the Civil War. So it's a fascinating time to study. Lincoln is a particularly complex and enigmatic personality because he changes through time. But I think that's the mark of greatness. We all need to change with time in a good direction. Obviously, we don't want to change in a destructive direction, but he changed, I find, in a very good direction. And I'd like to just highlight a couple of the events here on the timeline. This first speech, which was given yesterday in 1861, was given when Lincoln left Springfield. He was elected president and he was going to assume the presidency. There was a slight problem, however. If you see the time immediately before that speech, there were at least 6 states that had already receded from the Union before he even took office. So he had a great weight upon his shoulders, even from the very first moment he entered the presidency. And I will be quoting his second inaugural address. That will be the last speech I give. And that's about a 12-minute speech. That sounds like a long time, at least to memorize. It is a little bit long, but it would be much more arduous to try to memorize his first inaugural address, which was about 34 minutes. Now, that was a typical run time for most speeches. Now think of the Gettysburg Address. That's about a 4-minute speech, pretty quick. Edward Everett, who spoke before Lincoln at Gettysburg, spoke for approximately 3 hours.
Wow.
Remember, there was no television, there were no movies. That was a form of, you could say, entertainment, a form of, but it was a very, educational entertainment. But Edward Everett spoke. You'd think, what could he speak about for 3 hours? He spoke mostly about the individual elements of the battle. So he had it all planned out, and he was able to go through each movement and what had happened at Gettysburg. Before we get there, I just wanted to mention that farewell address. Now, I've decided to give the farewell address last. Just seemed the thing to do. So that's what I'm going to do. But that first inaugural address, that was about 34 minutes, was mostly an attempt with a rational argument to cajole the southern states back into the Union. But his attempt failed, and as you can see, within a month at Fort Sumter. Ironically, you can see the Civil War started April 15th, 1861. That was the exact day that Lincoln died 4 years later.
Wow.
So the Civil War started, you could say, with his life, and his life ended as the Civil War ended. The first speech, it's a short speech I'm going to give. It's called the Meditation on the Divine Will. It actually was never formally given as a speech. Nobody heard Lincoln speak these words. But it was found after his death by his White House Secretary John Hay in his papers. But it's very enlightening because it gives you a look into the heart of Lincoln. And sometimes people accuse Lincoln of just perhaps with his sentiments trying to make a political manipulation. But I think this speech clearly shows he was in deep struggle about what was going on in the Civil War. When this was given, the war had been already, when this was written, the war had already been going on for approximately a little over a year and a half almost. And already the battles had been contentious, and you'll actually see the battle that occurred at the exact same time was the Battle of Antietam, which was a Union victory in September 17, 1862, but at great cost. It's still known as the single bloodiest day in the history of American history. It says 22,717 dead, wounded, or missing. The actual number of dead is about 3,000. So you always hear casualties, 22,000 casualties. That refers to wounded as well as those who died. But it's still a tremendously high number. And it was the moment that Lincoln had been waiting for, however. He had realized as the war ground on and nothing was getting better, he began to have an idea that there was something that was holding back the end of the war. And his ultimate conclusion, as you see in his speeches, is that God was holding back the end of the war. And that until God's purpose was addressed, the war was not going to end. So we'll see his early struggles here in this speech, or in this writing, I should say. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be, wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. Yet, the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say that this is probably true, that God wills this contest, and he wills that it shall not end yet. By his mere great power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. Yet the contest began. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. And yet the contest proceeds. So that's the end of his thought. You can see he's struggling with why is this happening. He doesn't exactly come up with the answer there. But we'll hear this echoed in his second inaugural, where he does come up with an answer. What happened right at that time was he decided to proceed with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was made official on January 1st, 1863. This was a big struggle for him, but he actually said to his cabinet that he felt that God had directed him to do this. I don't want to get on too much of a off trail here, but the Emancipation Proclamation is a really interesting concept. Lincoln never characterized the Confederate States as the enemy, because he said, no, they're our country. This was truly a bit of lawyering, I would say, he came up with this idea. So he was trying to stay within the constitutional bounds. But he realized if he loses the country, he loses the Constitution. So he said, well, I've got to keep the country somehow. And he saw the slavery question as the pivotal point that needed to be solved before the war would end. So the idea that he came up with was to release the slaves. Not release the slaves in the border states, because there were states, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, that had slaves, but they weren't part of the Confederacy. He was always in danger of losing those states to the Confederacy. So everything had to be done with extreme care and caution. But the Constitution permitted him to take property from an enemy combatant. So even though he didn't consider the South an enemy, and he didn't consider slaves to be property, because the Confederacy considered themselves to be an enemy, and because the Confederacy considered slaves to be property, he used their definitions to effect the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's sticky. And the interesting thing is, have any of you ever read the Emancipation Proclamation? Ever heard it presented? Would you like me to present it today?
Yes.
I'm not going to. For one simple reason. It's a completely legal document. Whereas the party of the first part, it's not a flowery speech. It is a legal, tight document designed to closely define the objective. And so it's not meant for just oral presentation. But what it did affect was that he said, you slaves are free. Obviously, he had no way to enforce that, but just the act of doing this was demoralizing, and then also would interfere with other actions that had occurred where slaves had been ordered to be returned to their masters if they came into the North. Now this would start to have less force. But just before the Emancipation Proclamation, he wrote a letter to Congress on December 1st. I'm going to quote from some of that because it's become another famous part of Lincoln's writings. Interestingly enough, this was also never spoken by Lincoln. At that time, when the president wrote the Congress began their session in December, and the president would write a statement which would be read to the Congress by one of the other members. So he didn't get to say this, but here's what I think it would have sounded like. This is the very end of the statement. It's actually a long statement that would take probably about 25 minutes to present. I'll give you the last paragraph. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We say we are for the Union. The world will not forget that we say this. We know how to save the Union. The world knows we do know how to save it. Even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. Other means may succeed, this could not fail. The way is plain, peaceful, generous, just, a way which, if followed, the world will forever applaud, and God must forever bless. that was actually an offer for the border states to voluntarily give up their slaves, and he was going to pay them for it. It was his last ditch before the Emancipation Proclamation, which came a month later. But they didn't take him up on it. But the Emancipation Proclamation essentially accomplished it shifted the war's emphasis to, you could say, the real foundation of the war. It's not just states' rights anymore. It's actually slavery is the focus of the war. The next presentation I would like to give is Lincoln's most famous speech, his Gettysburg Address. If you can see on your timeline, on the second page, July 1st through 3rd, 1863, the battles of Gettysburg is fought, which has the largest number of casualties of the entire war because it spanned 3 days. 50,000. Remember, Antietam was 22,000. And it is the turning point of the war, halted Lee's advance north. So, there are no pictures of Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address. There was a photographer poised to take such a picture. He was setting up, and while he was setting up, the speech was over. Everett Horton had just preceded Lincoln 3 hours, and they had just asked the president to give a few remarks. Now, this was a large cemetery that was being designed. I went there once as Lincoln. Didn't attract too much attention. It's beautiful. It's set up like a garden. But when Lincoln gave the speech, it was not a garden. Only 1/3 of the bodies had been buried. And there were remains scattered over the landscape. It was not a pretty sight. But his speech is riveting, and to just add a little atmosphere to it, I'm going to put some music behind it. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated here to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. is the second inaugural. I really like this book, and if you're going to get one book on Lincoln, this is actually my all-time favorite. Lincoln's Greatest Speech, Ronald White. Talks about this particular speech, analyzes it very interestingly, and at the same time it's the backdrop of Lincoln's whole life. So it's a very small book in a sense. Sometimes Lincoln books get long and detailed. This is a really good one, and I think it reads well for high schoolers too, junior high and high schoolers. Very good book. But it describes the day when Lincoln gave his address. Has anybody read any of those accounts when Lincoln spoke? It was a very muddy day. It's March 4th. Inauguration was always March 4th. March 4th, 1865. And it was a muddy day, a rainy day, and the ceremonies had begun at first in the Senate chambers. But there were some preliminary speeches, including one by the Vice President-elect, Andrew Johnson, who was mostly drunk at the time. The weather started to clear. They moved everything outside. And people in the crowd remarked, as Lincoln got up to speak, the clouds parted, the sun came down. And many people in the crowd commented on that fact. It's detailed in that book. Very, very amazing. The expectation for that speech was the Civil War was 1 month from ending, but nobody was sure because everybody thought it was going to end in the first year, and then the second year, and then the third year, and the fourth year. So you'll see Lincoln gives no promises, although the war was so close to ending, and it was looking pretty much of a sure prospect. Everyone was expecting the usual second inaugural. Thank you for electing me. I appreciate your confidence. Look what we did already. Now we're going to do this. And this is the typical tenor of the second inaugural. What they got, as you see on the little quote there, Frederick Douglass said it best. He said, the speech was more of a sermon than a state paper. And when he greeted the president, he said that was a sacred effort. And it's a unique speech. It's never been given before or since in terms of it really being a theological analysis of the war. So I'll let Lincoln speak for himself. At this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there's less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Then a statement, somewhat in detail, of a course to be pursued, seemed fitting and proper. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of the great contest, which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself. And it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hopes for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war. Insurgent agents were in the city, seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that he be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we should suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as a woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work wherein, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So I think we'll agree, maybe, that Gettysburg is the most famous, but that was the greatest. That was the greatest. And I think I should give another lecture sometime about the way slavery was argued from the Bible. It's fascinating. But I will just give you the clue to the mystery. The Bible does talk about slavery. Obviously, the Israelites were slaves, but the Israelites had slaves, and God gave them direction on how to treat their slaves. When Jesus was here on the earth, before he rose to heaven, he did not condemn slavery as the ultimate sin. And the Apostle Paul has directions in his epistles of how to treat your slaves. Slavery was, you could say, a social institution. It was an economic institution. But there's a wordplay going on here. And I want you to realize that it happens so often in life. A word is shifted into another meaning. When the Bible talks about slavery, it says nothing about race entering into the equation. And that was what made American slavery, as Abraham Lincoln said, such an egregious sin. Because the slave was treated as a subhuman who had no rights. In Israel, Israel was told to circumcise their slaves, teach them your religion, and make them a part of your people. The American slaves were cut off from their families, were tortured, were treated brutally, not educated, in many instances, and it was a completely racially defined institution. So slavery, we should call it American slavery, is very different from biblical slavery. And yet, when the point was argued, there was not that distinction made. So the South said, hey, there are slaves in the Bible. Jesus never said slavery was the ultimate sin. The Apostle Paul tells us how to treat our slaves. So we just maybe got to do a better job. But before I close, I would like to just mention, as I point out in the paper there's 4 strong scriptural references in the Second Inaugural. And Lincoln was an enigma. He never officially joined a church. He was the first president, and perhaps maybe the only president, I have to research that never officially joined a church. And yet, he was our most theologically centered president. It's truly an enigma. And there's an interesting book here, which I like, called Lincoln's Battle with God by Stephen Mansfield, who hashes through that issue and tries to decide, was Lincoln a Christian? I believe he was. He was a somewhat unorthodox Christian, but he was a Christian. And unfortunately, what deepened his faith, unfortunate in the sense it was such a sad occurrence, but that's often how our faith does deepen, is through the loss of 2 of his children, first Eddie and then Willie. And each time he reached out to the pastors that were around him, and it's talked about even in the Greatest Speech book, how he sought counsel from the pastors in prayer. And but I just wanted to say, Lincoln was known to memorize. He had Shakespeare memorized. He had poetry memorized. And he knew the Bible too, because he read the Bible every day. So to sort of set the tenor for his thoughts on the Civil War, I would like to quote a passage of Scripture that I think he was very familiar with. It's 1 Corinthians 13. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, have not charity, I'm become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, have not charity, I'm nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth. For whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly. But then, face to face. Now I know in part. But then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity. These three. But the greatest of these is charity.
I'm just going to get a glass so it looked a little more realistic. Yeah. This will be great.
I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I just wanted you to see some of the complexity of Lincoln's speeches and why they sound so good. The Gettysburg Address there, you can see how each line connects to the next, either with a shared word or a shared thought. So I've sort of highlighted the words there, and even connects the back verse all the way back to the back verse, the back statement all the way back to the first. And I showed those lines: the nation conceived in liberty, the nation of new birth and freedom. Here's a trivia question for the day that I know a couple of you here I've talked to before, so you can't give the answer. But Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address and spontaneously, as he gave it, added 2 words. Does anybody know what the 2 words were? That's part of the mystique. It may have. It looks like he spent a lot of time writing it, but anyway, 2 words. Under God. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. So God, I believe the Holy Spirit, didn't let him forget. God was involved in this process. And then I just wanted you, on the last page, it shows you some of the second inaugural. And that one second section there where it says, on the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, look at all the D words. I've highlighted them. That's an oratory, it's alliteration, it's an oratory technique. Your mind engages with this even when you don't realize it's happening. But you can see there's 8 D words. And it's just sort of like a pistol shot going off. And he keeps talking about the war, the war, the war, the war, and the war came. He was a master rhetorician, really unbelievable the depths of his skills. If you about that speech, that Lincoln's Greatest Speech book is very interesting. That's where I found all that material. I didn't think of it myself. But you can take the Gettysburg Address and just start to find the commonalities. I actually did that. I knew that happened, and somebody told me about it, and then I just made the connections, and you can see how each side, the unfinished work, the great task, that cause, the great cause. So it turns out, if you were going to analyze the Gettysburg Address simply, they did their part. That was they were dedicated to saving the Union with their lives, and we have to be dedicated now to what's left behind of their work, so the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. It's a simple idea, but it's so eloquently expressed that it really has so much power to it. I think I will give the last speech, and then if you have questions or want to talk afterwards, I'll be there. Dear friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with the task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of the divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and will remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. And he never did go back. He got on that train, and when he did come back, he was in a box. So thank you for your kind attention. Okay, not too bad. I was hoping I didn't go over. If you have some questions, I don't pretend to know all the answers, but if you have questions on Abraham Lincoln or any of those speeches or any of the thoughts that I expressed, I'm happy to give you more information, or you can come up afterwards and we can talk and show you some of the books. I have a book up there I like called, as a matter of fact, I should give a copy to this place. I think I have an extra copy. The Civil War in Color. You know, when you see the black and white pictures, you sort of sometimes lose the immediacy of it. And when there's an excellent person that colorized everything, some of them are pretty grisly there. But yeah, it lends a starkness to the war, and you just realize how horrible. Even if you escaped with your life, you very often didn't escape with your arm or your leg. So it was a devastating time. But I still feel that the times we live in, there's lessons to be learned from history, and it's so important to know history so we can better understand the times we live in. We see the disagreement. We see the incorrect use of the Bible. It helps us, though, to just understand how carefully we have to read our Bible, and how we have to be careful how we define words, and realize it's easy to get misled. But I believe Lincoln was absolutely correct in saying that it's all about realizing that there is an almighty hand guiding the situation. And the more we can connect to that almighty, the more we have a chance to be fulfilling his will. Lincoln clearly felt and understood that the slavery question was the issue that had to be resolved before the Union could be reunited. And I pray for leaders that would have a similar wisdom to understand and seek God's will as they make the decisions. You know, it's not about whose side God is on, it's we want to be on God's side. By the way, thank you for coming. David Smith is here. He's with the Illinois Family Institute. I have to point him out. He and I crossed paths last Monday at a Republican gathering, so that was fun. We had one heckler, maybe two hecklers in the crowd, which was good. And it was fun. I got to do the Gettysburg Address, and then there's many judges and candidates that were there to.
I have a question for you, Mark.
Yes.
Do you know if Abraham Lincoln ever made it to this area of the state?
To Monique.
To Monique?
I know he made it, you know, so mostly, well, he was in, I forget what circuit it is. So he was mostly down in Springfield. They wouldn't have been this far north. I think the closest he got was maybe Ottawa,
Okay.
because he did do one of his debates up in Ottawa.
I think it was in Galena too.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Went to church in Galena.
Yeah,
And it was great, yeah.
good, thank you for that.
I have, well, one thing, in according to what David just said, I don't know if any of you knew, my husband's father was Leroy Deutsch, and he was kind of a character.
And so,
Lee Deutsch, is my husband,
yeah.
who just recently passed
Yes,
away.
I'm gonna say my condolences.
Yeah,
I just
thank
heard
you.
that.
But I have a couple of things, like, for example, Leroy Deutsch was born on your birthday. And there's a battle that went on around here about an airport. And there was a point where Jesse Jackson Jr. told us on his
I remember the
200th
battle well.
birthday, he was gonna fly an airplane off of, cause our farm is the, epicenter of it. And so Lee and I were standing down there waiting for Jesse Jackson to come and board his plane.
When was that gonna be? When was that gonna be?
Pardon me?
When was that gonna be?
On your 200th birthday, which would have been Leroy's 100th.
Oh, 09.
So, 09, yes,
09.
yeah, yeah.
So, now, that was another example of religion and politics having a sort of a strange coalition going there.
But Leroy also, I knew Leroy long before I knew Lee. And so when I would see Lee out in public, I would be kind of discouraged that he would just wave to me, because actually Leroy would call and lecture me on how we're not supposed to buy forest preserve land. And I used to tell Deutsch, we did anyway. But if I had your farm and your front porch to sit on and look at this immense land, I wouldn't like it either, but many of us don't have that. But he would call often, and I hadn't met him, we would just speak, until I did finally meet him, and he came into my office, and I said, "You're Leroy Deutsch?" I thought Leroy was Lee. So we settled that whole story. But Leroy would always tell me that actually he spent the night on their farm. And he'd have me go look at this little, and it was the chicken.
Who spent the night?
Yeah, Abraham, you did. But,
Oh, really?
Yes, he did. But Lee told me that was just his father, that it was a chicken.